On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, President Ronald Reagan came to the cliffs of Normandy. He spoke of the heroism of a battalion of Army Rangers who had scaled those cliffs under enemy fire, among the millions who gave their lives to liberate Europe.
These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. And these are the heroes who helped end a war.
Reagan made a passionate plea to his fellow Americans that day to give meaning to those heroes' sacrifice by never turning their back on the world ever again.
We in America have learned bitter lessons from 2 world wars. It is better to be here ready to protect the peace than to take blind shelter across the sea.
America had been protecting the peace with powerful alliances for decades.
We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent.
Reagan was expressing a hallowed American ideal, a bipartisan value shared by every president since World War II.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first.
Until recently. This is what today's Republican Party sounds like.
My amendment would direct the president withdrawal from NATO.
NATO has, for decades, sucked on the teat of the American taxpayer.
This is how it talks about longtime allies.
In France, they have all sorts of problems. Germany is a disaster.
And this is what it thinks about the world.
Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo. We've been talking about this for a long time. Thank you.
As President Donald Trump walked away from more international deals than any other president in American history.
This moment has been a long time coming.
From the Iran nuclear deal
The Iran deal is defective.
to climate change
I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris.
to trade.
We're going to keep out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
And according to his own national security advisor, John Bolton,
The 12 nations undertake the common security.
he threatened to pull out of the best deal America ever made,
They were sworn to stand together against aggression.
the NATO alliance. It tore down a wall,
The red flag of the failed Soviet Union at last came down.
defeated an empire,
Sea, land, and air coordination.
and still defends almost 1 billion people from those hungry for conquest.
NATO is obsolete, it's old, it's fat, it's sloppy.
How did we get here? The fact is, America has been here before. To understand, we need to look back and tell the story of America first. Welcome to a special hour on American isolationism. I'm Fareed Zakaria. When we first heard the campaign slogan, America First, in the 2016 campaign, it felt like a startling break from the past that came out of nowhere. But history often repeats itself, and when we look to the past, America First was said to be the nation's guiding principle for most of its existence. The story begins with the Founding Fathers. George Washington, the nation's first president, said famously in his farewell address that America should steer clear of permanent alliances with other countries.
George Washington not only said that we should avoid entangling alliances, but he referred to it as the Great Rule.
That great rule, a kind of policy bedrock of neutrality, was the touch point for American policymakers.
Washington's warning made perfect sense for a young, weak republic and its fragile experiment in democracy. Alliances could lead to war, and war could lead to invasion, as well as dangerous division and even tyranny on the home front.
The tyranny of a standing army and the kind of general who might be governing it.
America's wisest course would be to enjoy the protection of its massive moats, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. After all, the nation has a hemisphere to itself, Thomas Jefferson noted.
America is going to prosper by neutrality, by trade, and by internal development.
But while America steered clear of Europe, it expanded aggressively in its own backyard, building an empire at home, free from power politics abroad. It doubled its size with the Louisiana Purchase and captured much of the West in the Mexican War. That's not quite isolationism. Manifest destiny was America's creed in its own hemisphere, a belief that God had ordained its conquest of a continent.
The transplanting of indigenous peoples, seizing of their land, and what many people call a genocide against indigenous Americans.
Avoiding entanglements with the rest of the world turned a weak republic into a continental powerhouse. The United States was leading the world in manufacturing by the late 1800s. Immigrants seeking freedom and fortune flocked to its shores. And a nation now brimming with confidence was becoming a great power. In 1913,
Wilson was nominated and easily defeated a split Republican ticket.
Woodrow Wilson became president.
Woodrow Wilson is a complex character.
He began with a declaration that he would stick to the core principles of Washington and Jefferson, that he had no intent to intervene abroad.
Wilson's main focus was his historic domestic agenda, including massive labor reforms, antitrust measures, and other progressive achievements. It would be the irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs, he said. Fate intervened with World War I. Wilson was determined to keep America out of the war. Having witnessed the horrors of America's Civil War as a child. He won re-election on a promise of peace.
He runs for re-election in 1916. World War I's been going on for 2 years, on the platform of "He kept us out of the war."
Thousands of tons of shipping are destroyed weekly.
But then, Germany ramped up its aggression with an all-out attack on American ships, sinking 3 of them.
Congress passes a resolution.
An agonized president felt he had no choice but to go to war. Now in the conflict, Wilson went all in, vowing to win the war and, more importantly, win the peace. To create a system that would eliminate the death spiral of European conflicts.
Woodrow Wilson is the pivotal figure, I would argue, in American foreign policy thought.
Wilson studied the causes of war and came up with 14 points to eradicate it, including the League of Nations, which would mediate quarrels in a new civilized world.
Statesmen assembled to draw up the peace treaty.
Germany agreed to peace based on Wilson's 14 points.
In December of 1918, Wilson sailed for France.
And he was hailed in Europe as a savior. His bold idea for a new world order was popular, but it proved ahead of its time.
The opposition
Back home, the League was met with stiff Republican resistance. So Wilson took his case directly to the American people, barnstorming the country. Without the League, there would be another world war, Wilson warned. His impassioned defense seemed to be winning people over. But suddenly, he was felled by a massive stroke, leaving his left side paralyzed. His wife kept it secret and quietly ran the country. The League went down to defeat, and an invalid Wilson finished his term, passing away just 3 years later. With Woodrow Wilson died any hope of a lasting peace.
Another war, not for me. This time America should keep out, and I know I will.
Coming up,
we cannot win this war for England. That is why the America First Committee has been formed.
America turns inward like never before.
Ruthless aggression and conquest.
And Woodrow Wilson's dark prophecy comes true.